Thank you for the nice lunch. My name is Maja Østby, and I'm working at the University College of Østfold and also University College of Molde. And I'm part of the working group in this network of inclusive research. First, I would like to thank VID University for hosting this seminar, and Anita and Anna especially for organizing it. Last year in November, the network was established in our first seminar in Molde. And in just a year, the knowledge about the Norwegian projects using an inclusive approach has grown. And we have to get to know each other. This gives us the opportunity to learn from and inspire each other. One thing that is most useful for the Norwegian movement towards more inclusive research is to learn from experienced persons. And we are so lucky to have 3 such persons to present on today's seminar. Thank you so much for sharing your information, and it's highly appreciated. So first, Professor Melanie Nide. You are a professor in education at the University of Southampton. You're director of the Center for Research and Inclusion in the Southampton Education School.
Yes.
And you are one of the co-directors of the ESRC National Center for Research Methods, where you lead the research on the pedagogy of research methods. And your recent research projects have focused on pedagogy, on innovation in research methods, and on quality in inclusive research. And between all of your publications, I especially want to mention this book. And I don't earn anything about it. I just think it's very good. So please, Melanie.
Thank you.
The floor is yours to tell us about what inclusive research is. Give us a historical and theoretical introduction.
Thank you very much. I'd be delighted. So it's really nice to be here and to see some familiar faces from when we were here a year ago in Molde, and to meet many new people too. So first of all, my apologies if you were in the seminar last year and I say something again that I said a year ago. But I'm sure you will have forgotten it again and it won't matter. But there is obviously some overlap, but my job in the seminar today, I think, really is to set the scene a little bit and to say, where has this movement or set of movements towards inclusive research come from, and what's it all about? And then I hand over to colleagues with a real kind of on-the-ground, live current experience to illustrate some of what I say. So I'll be talking at a more kind of theoretical, general level to set the scene. So, what is inclusive research? The book's a couple of years old now, and I should have read it on the way here, and it would help. But really, I'm going to use a metaphor today. I like a metaphor, something standing in for something else. I think before, when I was here, I was talking about my metaphor of if inclusive research was a cake, what would the ingredients be? And many of our research participants played around with that metaphor of what would be the icing and what would be the core thing in the middle of the cake. But today I've got a different metaphor, a different way of us thinking about that. And this is inclusive research as a tree, an apple tree that has grown, and I'm going to talk about the seeds that have been the foundation of inclusive research, and the way it has grown, and the way now really we have an orchard with lots of different types of inclusive research. And I want to end up with the fruits of our inclusive research. What does it produce? Why are we growing this movement of a different way of doing inclusive research? So that's the way I'm going to do it. I hope it works for you. So let's go back to the seeds. Sorry, Andy, if you just wobbled. Let's go back to the seeds and having the right climate and the right beginnings for inclusive research to come about. In England, and I know it's different in Norway, and that's one of the things we talk about in the network and how interesting it is, But in England, part of the sowing of the seeds and the right climate for this inclusive research to grow was the powerful self-advocacy movement. And this was people with learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, coming together to find a kind of collective voice and to say, you know, this is what it was like for us living in the institutions, or this is what it's been like not having decisions or autonomy or much say in how our lives are lived. And that self-advocacy movement was this growing in confidence and sense of self and sense of rights and sense of personhood, if you like. And from that sense of personhood, people were saying, you know, who are you to come along and do your research on me, to poke and prod me, to take photographs of me, to take bits of me away with you and write them up in your papers as if belong to you. I'm something for you to examine and explore. I am a person in my own right, and therefore my voice needs to be in that research, and I need to be treated respectfully in that research. And hey, actually I could do some of that research with you or with others with learning disabilities. So that self-advocacy movement has been really grassroots, growing up, people saying, hey, I'm here and I'm not happy with the way that research has treated me. And I think that's been so sobering for us as academics. We really had to kind of gulp and say, maybe that wasn't right. Maybe we should have a different vision for how research should be. So another kind of sowing the seeds has been around social role valorisation, which is very familiar to you in the Nordic countries, I think. And, you know, we in England, we think of it as a normalisation movement as well from the States, but we know the nurture social valorisation. And this was this whole kind of idea that people with learning disabilities can have valued social roles, and one of those valued social roles in society can be as a researcher or an active research participant or somebody on an advisory committee advising around research. So that, along with self-advocacy, were useful things in coming together. And then, of course, we had the social model of disability, in which people were saying that disability, we are disabled by the way we are treated by society. Disablement isn't necessarily something we're born with, it's something that happens in an active social process, and therefore it's a social dynamic that we can challenge and change. It doesn't have to be this way. So we've come to understand that our research can be more disabling or less disabling. It can actually be enabling. So we can begin to think about research through this lens of the process. But one of the things that book was about, what is inclusive research? Because that book isn't just about inclusive research in the learning disability sphere, it's about it generally. It's about saying something very interesting happened that kind of passed some people by, that while the self-advocacy movement was growing some inclusive research, the feminist movement was growing feminist research, and there was decolonising research and participatory health research, and there were different groups fighting their own battles in their own ways, in their own worlds, but they all had this thing in common, saying, hey, treat me with respect. You know, I am not the subject of other people's research. And it came from different spheres. And I'm really shocked, really, how little it's joined up and how little dialogue there has been between feminists and Indigenous peoples and disabled peoples about what they have in common in their relationships with research. But each of those groups have kind of come to this realisation in their own time and in their own terms. And I hope that the future is going to be more dialogue. So we now have the seeds going into a little sapling, a little tree is beginning to grow. And part of the growth of a movement, I think, is when something gets a name. So some of our historical roots around this growth of inclusive research. People weren't calling it inclusive research. People weren't really quite sure what to call what they were doing, and that's why we've had all these multiple names and different ways of describing what we do. But Jan Walmsley and Kelly Johnson are two researchers who really clearly gave this thing a name. Jan initially in 2001 in a paper, and then together in a book, Inclusive Research for People with Learning Disabilities. Is that right? Yes. And they pulled together, I think, the key kind of what this thing is about. They say it's the idea of research that involves people who may otherwise be seen as subjects for the research, as instigators of ideas, research designers, interviewers, data analysts, authors, disseminators, users, that all of these people with learning disabilities who before we did our research on can actually occupy these very many different roles in research. So this was naming inclusive research in this way of changing the research relationship. There's an awful lot written and spoken about power and levelling the playing field, changing the power dynamic. A lot of it I personally find quite problematic because it's almost as if power is a commodity that in the past academics held and they passed over as a gift to disabled people to say, here, you can have some of my power. And of course, that's a very unhelpful thing because power given as a gift can be taken back. And it's much better, I think, to have a kind of Foucauldian notion of power as process, power as negotiation, power as this dynamic thing that is wielded and fought over and used for good and for bad. So I think the whole notion of power in research is actually more complex than a simple narrative about inclusive research is about giving some of the power over. I think there's more to it than that. And I would say that the field of inclusive research, as it's grown, has been a bit of a battlefield, a bit of a battle with that power. I'm going to take some, I'm going to give some, I'm going to give you some back, I'm going to hit you with some of my power's bigger than your power. Some of these battles have gone on, so I wouldn't want to present you with a historical journey as if it's all been beautiful and wonderful and this moment of enlightenment. Certainly in England it hasn't been like that. It's been a bit fraught at times and painful. And some of this, actually we're taking research for ourselves and academics need to step back a bit, has been hurtful for academics. Academics will tell stories of being bruised and battered from it. I suspect far less bruised and battered than people with learning disabilities have been over the years from what research has done for them. But certainly, this isn't always smooth. But let's go back to some of these key kind of theoretical ideas in inclusive research. Really important that we have these in our minds today. So this is about doing research with people with learning disabilities, not on them. So we work with you. And it might be by people with learning disabilities without academic researchers, actually. Or it might be research very much for people with learning disabilities in their interests. So we've got these different models. But central in all of that is this idea of valuing the views and experiences of the people concerned. I don't know what happens in your universities, but in my university we sometimes have student user groups on things. At the moment we're trying to develop a new piece of software and there's a student for student use and there's a student representative, and when he tries to speak sometimes the academic will say, no, what the students say, and you kind of have to kick him and say, let the students say what the students say. And so sometimes valuing of voices and experiences, it's about actually saying, better to get that from the horse's mouth, we would say in England, better to hear directly from you about your experience, rather than have that experience filtered through the lens of an academic gaze. So this is about asking directly, enabling people to tell the story directly, and really valuing not just experiences but views as well. What was that like for you? How do you see that? How do you understand that? And if we think about just general qualitative research, of course that was the qualitative research movement, wasn't it, in some ways? It was about saying, you know, we want to hear people's voices and views, but this is taking this a little bit further perhaps. There's also a key thing in inclusive research about researching the things that really matter to the people with learning disabilities. So some of the topics that have gone on in the past haven't been in the interests of people with learning disabilities, haven't been interesting to them, and there's been this kind of sense that the academics have set the agenda. So some of this is changing who sets the agenda, who says what's interesting. And what really matters. So we've had growth of research on things like friendships. People saying, actually, how do I make friends and get out and meet people? This is what's important to me. Research around money. How do I get money, keep money, spend money? Just some very different topics to the topics that academics were prioritising, perhaps. And this is very much a movement about doing research that aims to improve people's lives. So if you're doing a piece of research just because it's inherently interesting and you as an academic has set the agenda, it's unlikely to be thought of as inclusive research. Whereas actually, and I find this fascinating, some of the research where the agenda has been set by people with learning difficulties has been quite blue skies in a way, quite, you know, we're interested in this because we're interested in it, not just this pragmatic, you know, this will make my life better. So I was always fascinated by a project that went on in the UK, which was about what did people with learning disabilities do in the war, in the Second World War, because that wasn't in the textbooks. The people with learning disabilities couldn't find their place in that history. Nothing was written about what they did or where they were, and uncovering that history was just a really inherent kind of curiosity-driven piece of research. And I think that's one of the kind of, in a way, most rich pieces of research, when it's driven by this intellectual curiosity, as much research is, and treating people with respect. So when I first started speaking, I was talking about an inclusive research movement. But actually, I think there's been multiple movements. You know, we can't pin it down to one movement. Things are shifting all over the place from different directions. And this is where my notion of the orchard comes in. You know, we haven't been growing one great big apple tree. We've got these different movements. And some of it has been called participatory research. Some of it has been much more emancipatory, so grassroots-led. We've had this kind of user-led, this idea that people who use services should be doing the research on those services. Peer research, that it's better if I'm a person with learning disabilities if I do the interview with another person with learning disabilities. Activist scholarship, democratic research. Some of this has been written about as the democratization of research, the spreading out of the decision making. So lots of different kind of primary aims or ways of conceptualizing and talking about it. I like co-production very much, this idea that together we co-produce knowledge, that neither academics nor people with learning disabilities can produce new knowledge on their own, that knowledge is richer when it is co-produced, done together. But although you've got all of these different movements, there is this kind of solid trunk to it all. There is a solid, you can see where I'm going, this solid kind of thing that holds it all together. And this is this idea that you can't really do inclusive research without asking and struggling over some of these really big questions. And they are big questions. Who owns this research? We can struggle over that. Is this actually a piece of academic research, academic owned, funded, published, that you've just invited people in a little bit to? Or is it, owned by the people with learning disabilities and they've actually decided to commission an academic to do some of the bits that's challenging for them? Or is this piece of research genuinely co-owned? So who owns the research? In whose interests is the research? And I really want to stress that none of these questions have a correct answer. And none of these questions should force us, I think, into false dichotomies. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. In whose interest is this research? It doesn't have to be academic interests or disabled persons' interests. It can be both interests, or it can be a bit of that is more in my interests and a bit of that is more in your interests. The critical thing is that there's something shared here that we need each other for, that is our coming together point. That's my view anyway. You have to grapple with these questions. Who has control over the processes and the outcomes? I wrote something deliberately provocative a few years back, which was around participatory data analysis. Is this a step too far when we actually hand over and share the analysis of the data? Because I know when I do a research project, that's when it gets really interesting. When you've got some data and you're in there and what is all this saying to you? And often in research, participatory research, that was the time when the academics took back control and said, thank you, it was great that we had all of these participatory methods for generating all this data. Now I've got it, thank you. And I've been guilty of that. It's the really key bit. So, who's got control over what process, what outcomes? Who makes the decisions and who produces the knowledge? So I'm not giving you the answers. I'm saying that these are the questions that we have to kind of face in all of this. Now if I move to a bit more of the history in terms of two phases, and I think in the UK, and wider than that, but not universal, we can say that there's been a first generation of inclusive research. And this first generation of inclusive researchers have sown the seeds for us and grown this tree. And we can benefit from them, the people who've gone before us. And this first generation, I think, has established in a way the rationale why we need inclusive research. That argument, I would say, has been made and won. I wouldn't say it's been made and won everywhere and not made and won with all funders, but it's been made and won enough times for us to really kind of feel sure of our footing around the rationale. We know why it is we might want to make our research more inclusive. I think that first generation of researchers, they've identified, debated and worked through the challenges. They've grappled with those big questions. Doesn't mean to say that a new project doesn't have to grapple with them afresh, but it doesn't have to start from ground zero. And this is one of the things I really think will be sad if every new inclusive research project has to begin from the beginnings again. We've got to stand on each other's shoulders and start from what's gone before. So some of the ways people have worked through those challenges we can work with and build on. And those projects have made some important findings, of course. But the emphasis in that first generation has very much been on roles and process, practical knowledge. How do we do this thing? But we cannot go on for decade after decade after decade working out how to do this thing, because that won't get us anywhere. We actually have to move on from the fascinating, and it draws you in. It is fascinating. I review lots and lots of papers about how do we do this thing. I usually learn something new in each one. But we have to move on from that into a new generation in a way. So from our first generation, we've got our three primary models. One is the advisory model, where the research goes on, but the people with learning disabilities are the advisory group. They're the people that steer it and push it in certain directions. We've got the model of them taking charge, and we've got the model of co-researching or collaborating. You've got all variations on those, but I think you can kind of think of these three main strands. But before we can move on to another generation and push this thing forward into the future, because histories always end up in futures, we have to actually unstifle the debate. And it's Jan Walmsley and Kelly Johnson in their book who use that language of unstifling the debate. So this was the thing about taking off our rose-tinted glasses and not just saying, isn't it wonderful, what wonderful inclusive research we now do, but actually saying this thing is troublesome and difficult, and how much value really is added to that piece of research by having people with learning disabilities involved, or how genuine is that involvement. Simone Aspis, a very powerful voice in the self-advocacy movement in the UK, talks about people with learning disabilities being used as puppets. You know, it looks better because they're involved, but their involvement is quite superficial. We have to ask ourselves questions about, is inclusive research actually ethically or morally superior to other kinds of research? Or is it just another way of doing it that exists alongside? We've got the training conundrum that we've been talking about this morning. Do we have to train up all this big body of inclusive researchers with learning disabilities so that they are like other researchers, academic researchers, or do they have their own skills? We need to debate things about the quality and the analysis. So we're now moving into this second generation of inclusive research. And in this second generation, I think, we are building on what's come before. So we're saying we've got some practical knowledge. We know some of the process things. Now we've really got to get to grips with how good science and good inclusion can come together, so that we can make sure that what we're doing in inclusive research is actually good research. And this is where I kind of come in with my doing research inclusively study to say, what does it look like at that cusp where it is both good inclusion and good research. And I certainly shared this with the people who were at Mulder last year. You know, we begin to get that coming together of good research, good inclusion, when we can answer questions that we would not otherwise be able to answer, but that are important. If I could do that study perfectly well on my own, without a person with learning disabilities involved, then why am I involving them? Similarly, if a little group of people with learning disabilities can do that research perfectly well without having an academic involved, why involve them? So, you know, there has to be a reason, there has to be some value added. It becomes good inclusive research, I think, when we get access in ways we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. We can get into new knowledge, knowledge holders, new participants. We can make critical use of that insider knowledge. And this is part of the second generation, I think, that we dare to question each other's knowledge. So it's not about saying, you know, I know this in an academic way, you know this in a lived way, but actually saying, and therefore we can challenge each other's knowledge and see where that takes us. And we're moving into research, I think, for it to be good quality, to have this kind of authentic, recognisable feel, and for it to make an impact on people's lives. But the future, in terms of the future, where are we going with all of this? It has to be around the fruits now. we have to be making inclusive research bear fruit. We need to be getting some really decent quality knowledge that's come from rigorous processes. And I've written a bit recently about praxis. Praxis is this lived wisdom, this practical wisdom, and we have a lot of practical wisdom now around doing research in an inclusive way. And what that's shown to us is that we don't have to choose between being principled and being realistic, that what inclusive researchers do is bring those together. They're principled and realistic. It's not an either or, it's a together. And once they're together, we can really begin to enjoy the fruits of inclusive research. So we don't have to now, I think, spend all of our time justifying ourselves. We don't have to justify our different expertise and why we're there. We don't have to continually say, are we doing it right? As if there's some gold standard way of doing inclusive research, because we've established there are multiple ways of doing it. What we can begin to focus on more is doing good research, doing our research well, not right, but well. Creating new spaces for our research to happen, new bridges with the feminists and the decolonisers and the indigenous peoples and so on. Valuing the diversity of the models and valuing the knowledge that's coming out from here. So I think this is where we're getting up to date now, where we're actually beginning to see research papers that just spend a little bit of time saying, hey, this was a piece of inclusive research and this is what we found. I think that's when it's matured. That's when we know we've got something mature. And in different places, it'll be at different stages. So I'll stop there and sorry if I've gone on too long, see if anybody wants to come back at me around any of that. Thank you.
We have a good amount of time later today, so I think we should take one question or comment. We should allow ourselves that opportunity. Anyone?
No? That's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
And Melanie, just to stand a little bit, would you?
Yes, I have to present of this your presentation.
Thank you. Oh, there's something round there.
Yes,
Oh. Woo. Look at that. That's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really nice. Thank
And
you.
I have to tell you that this one, it's called Sannes cuckoo.
Oh.
Yeah. It's made of clay, and the first Sannes cuckoo was produced in 1840. So it's to market the local potteries, and today Sannes has only one pottery and it's made there.
Oh,
So
lovely. Isn't that great? Thank you.
Thank you for a nice
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you. I shall let other people get on.